My career ended 30 seconds after my name appeared on the global call, and I understood that before a single accusation was spoken. My name is Daniel Weiss, and for 8 years I had worked in clinical trial logistics for one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in Europe, the kind of company whose logo appears in hospital corridors and whose mistakes never make the news. I was not a public figure inside the organization. I was a background role, a global clinical supply lead, responsible for making sure experimental drugs reached trial sites across continents under strict temperature, timing, and regulatory constraints. I worked from wherever the crisis was hottest. That morning it was Zurich, a borrowed glass conference room overlooking the river, sterile and quiet, my laptop humming on a table that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. The global status meeting had started like every other one. Faces from Basel, New Jersey, Singapore, Prague, all flattened into muted rectangles, everyone pretending this was routine. The study in question was a late-stage oncology trial, already under pressure from regulatory delays and border inspections. Nothing unusual in this world, nothing we hadn't managed before. I was prepared to give a factual update. Instead, my manager spoke first. Richard Hale had been promoted fast, the kind of leader who mastered optics but never carried operational weight. When he cleared his throat and said my name, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. He was smiling. Not nervous, not angry, but satisfied. He didn't ask for my report. He didn't ask for context. He said, calmly, "We need to address a failure in clinical supply leadership," and let the word failure hang across time zones. I felt heat rise in my chest. He continued, accusing me of poor planning, negligence, and worst of all, potential risk to patient continuity. In this industry, those words are poison. I watched the reactions unfold in real time. Legal stopped typing. Quality assurance looked down. Regional heads leaned closer to their screens. I wanted to speak. I wanted to explain that the delay he was referencing came from a customs hold caused by a regulator's surprise audit, that he himself had instructed me verbally to reroute supply without escalating, that the cost-saving reallocation he demanded had reduced our buffer stock. Every decision was documented, every deviation was signed, most of them by him. But I also understood something else in that moment. This was not spontaneous. Richard wasn't improvising, he was executing a plan. He spoke as if the conclusion had already been reached, framing the narrative with practiced precision, using language designed not to invite discussion but to establish record. He ended by saying the role might need restructuring, a sentence that everyone on that call understood as removal. Then he thanked me for my efforts and moved on. No one defended me. Not because they didn't know the truth, but because defending me meant standing against the person who controlled budgets, promotions, and future access. When the call ended, the silence in the room felt heavier than the accusations. I stared at my reflection in the black screen and saw a man who had spent years absorbing risk for others, staying late to prevent escalations, smoothing over deviations so leadership presentations stayed clean. Slowly, the past year replayed itself in my head with brutal clarity. The pressure to close issues faster, the requests to keep sensitive decisions off email, the subtle warnings not to involve compliance unless absolutely necessary. Richard hadn't just humiliated me, he had positioned me as the future explanation for problems he knew were coming. I opened the trial documentation on my laptop and scrolled through the protocols. My name appeared everywhere as designated responsible person, the legal anchor tying operational reality to regulatory accountability. I remembered a conversation 6 weeks earlier when I had warned Richard that accumulated exceptions were becoming dangerous. His response had been simple: "We'll deal with it later, just keep things moving." Later had arrived, and it was wearing my name. The anger came last, slow and cold. I understood then that staying would destroy me, leaving quietly would bury me, and confronting him openly would only validate the story he was already telling. What I had, and what he underestimated, was responsibility. My signature was the reason uncomfortable truths remained invisible. Sitting alone in that glass room, I accepted something I had resisted for years. The system depended on my silence, and I was done providing it. As I closed my laptop and reached for my phone to draft a message I had never intended to write, I knew there was no version of the future where nothing broke, and for the first time in my career, I was prepared to let it happen.
The night after the call, I didn't sleep, not because I was angry in the loud way people expect, but because my mind kept circling the same question with clinical precision. How much damage would occur if I stopped protecting the system the way I always had? I lay in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision I had ever justified for the sake of momentum, every deviation I had closed with language soft enough to pass audits, but strong enough to keep regulators at bay. Part of me wanted to believe Richard had crossed a line impulsively, that this could be corrected with a conversation, but another part, quieter and far more dangerous, had already accepted the truth. He had chosen me as insulation. If something broke, it would break on my name. That realization brought fear, because what I was considering wasn't revenge in the emotional sense, it was structural, and structures don't care who gets hurt along the way. By morning, I had made a decision not to resign yet. Resignation was the visible end. I needed to understand the invisible beginning. I went to the office as usual, nodded at people who suddenly avoided my eyes, and opened my calendar. Meetings were being quietly removed. Access requests I submitted took longer to approve. The organization was already treating me like a liability. That stung more than the humiliation itself, and it sharpened my focus. I began reviewing my own trail, not to hide anything, but to see it as an outsider would. Emails, meeting notes, risk acceptances, temperature excursions signed off under exceptional circumstances. I realized how often my name had been used as reassurance. Daniel has reviewed this. Daniel is comfortable proceeding. Daniel will cover it.
The internal conflict hit hardest there. I had built my identity on being the person who held things together, and now the only way to survive was to stop doing exactly that. I drafted a resignation letter 3 times and deleted it 3 times. Every version felt like surrender. What I needed wasn't an exit, but a boundary so precise it couldn't be reframed. That was when I focused on my designation as responsible person across multiple active protocols. It wasn't ceremonial, it was legal. Without that designation, risk classifications changed automatically. Systems escalated. Audits triggered. It was a lever no one talked about because pulling it was considered unthinkable. I tested the idea in the smallest possible way. I requested clarification from quality on whether my designation extended to a newly added trial amendment that had been rushed through the week before. The response came back cautious, almost nervous, confirming that yes, it did, pending my acceptance. I didn't accept it. I asked for a formal risk assessment instead. That single action delayed nothing materially, but it did something else. It made people uncomfortable. Richard emailed me within hours, curt, asking why I was slowing things down. I replied politely, referencing compliance language, asking for written confirmation of his risk tolerance. He didn't answer. That silence told me more than any admission could. Over the next few days, I took small risks, each one measured. I stopped resolving issues verbally. I summarized conversations in writing. I asked QA to be included for visibility. Each action was defensible on its own, but together they changed the temperature. Colleagues began warning me quietly to be careful, that I was attracting attention. I was already aware. What I wasn't prepared for was how quickly resistance would harden. An internal audit request I submitted was downgraded without explanation. A compliance officer I trusted called me privately and said my questions were being labeled as disruptive. That word landed harder than I expected. Disruptive meant I was no longer useful. It meant the narrative Richard had started was gaining traction. Doubt crept in then. I wondered if I was miscalculating, if I was about to be buried under bureaucracy before I could do anything meaningful. The fear wasn't of losing my job, that was inevitable. The fear was of acting too late, of resigning without consequence, of letting the story end with me. I took my biggest risk on a Friday afternoon. I submitted a formal notice requesting reassessment of my responsible person status due to material concerns regarding cumulative deviations. The language was neutral, almost boring, but it forced a process no one wanted to engage. The response didn't come that day. It came Monday morning, and it wasn't what I expected. Instead of escalation, I received a calendar invite titled Alignment Discussion, mandatory, with Richard and legal. No QA, no compliance, just them. As I accepted the invite, my hands shook for the first time since the call. I had hoped for a quiet procedural shift. Instead, I was being pulled into a room where narratives were rewritten. Whatever happened next would determine whether my plan had teeth or whether I had just exposed myself without protection. The meeting with Richard and legal took place in a narrow conference room without windows, the kind designed to make time feel elastic. Richard arrived relaxed, almost friendly, as if the global call had never happened. The lawyer, a woman I barely knew, opened her laptop and said this was an informal alignment, which was the first lie of the hour. They wanted me contained, not aligned. Richard spoke about pressure, about optics, about how tone matters in leadership, carefully avoiding any mention of facts. When I reiterated my concerns about cumulative deviations and asked for written confirmation of risk ownership, the lawyer intervened smoothly, reminding me of my obligations to the company and hinting that unnecessary escalation could have career implications. That was the moment I understood the moral line I was approaching. If I continued, I would not just be protecting myself, I would be forcing the company to confront realities that could halt trials, affect patients, and burn years of work for people who had nothing to do with Richard's ambition. I left the room with a polite smile and a weight in my chest that made breathing feel deliberate. That night, I reviewed the trial dashboards again and noticed something I had missed before. Several deviations had been reclassified months earlier under a broader category, effectively diluting their visibility. The reclassification had been approved by Richard during a period when I was traveling and unreachable. It wasn't illegal, but it was aggressive, the kind of maneuver that only works if no one looks too closely. I realized then that the story was bigger than my humiliation. This wasn't about one manager throwing someone under the bus. It was about a system that rewarded concealment as long as the numbers looked clean. The psychological pressure intensified as small consequences began to surface. A regional side contacted me directly, confused about conflicting instructions regarding temperature monitoring. A QA manager asked why certain reports no longer matched archived data. Each question was a thread, and pulling any of them risked unraveling something I wasn't sure I was ready to expose. I hesitated for the first time. I imagined headlines, regulatory holds, patients waiting. I asked myself whether my need for justice justified collateral damage. The answer came not as emotion, but as clarity. The damage already existed. I was just the person preventing it from being acknowledged. The unexpected turn came from an unlikely source. An internal compliance analyst, junior and visibly nervous, requested a private call. She told me she had been instructed to deprioritize certain findings tied to my programs and asked whether that was normal. Hearing it out loud changed everything. This wasn't just pressure from above, it was instruction downward. I advised her to document everything and thanked her, knowing that by doing so, I had crossed a point of no return. Within hours, Richard emailed me again, this time less controlled, asking why people were panicking and reminding me that loyalty mattered in moments like this. I felt the isolation fully then. Colleagues stopped messaging, my calendar emptied, I was being quarantined. I took my boldest step yet, not externally, but internally. I drafted a formal withdrawal of my responsible person designation, effective in 30 days, citing inability to ethically assume accountability under current conditions. It was a nuclear option wrapped in compliance language. I didn't send it immediately. I stared at the document for a long time, aware that sending it would trigger audits, sponsor notifications, and regulatory scrutiny. It would also make me the villain in many eyes. Before I could decide, another complication hit. Legal placed me on temporary administrative review, restricting my system access pending clarification. That move was meant to freeze me, to prevent exactly what I was considering. The irony was brutal. By limiting my access, they validated my concern that accountability was being manipulated. I forwarded the withdrawal notice to my personal email, hands steady now, fear replaced by resolve. The psychological tension peaked when I received a call from a trial investigator asking whether the study was safe to continue. I couldn't answer directly. I could only say that processes were under review. Hanging up, I felt the full moral weight of the situation. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was exposure. I returned to my apartment, opened the document one last time, and added a single line requesting immediate reassessment by compliance and external audit bodies. When I finally sent it, I knew I had put everything at risk: my reputation, my future in the industry, and possibly the trials themselves. As the confirmation pinged, a new email arrived almost simultaneously, marked urgent, summoning me to an emergency executive call. The timing told me everything. They had realized what I had done, and whatever came next would determine whether the truth surfaced or whether I would be crushed under the weight of it. The emergency executive call assembled faster than any meeting I had ever seen, faces blinking into place with a brittle urgency of people who already knew the outcome would be expensive. Richard was there, pale now, his earlier confidence stripped away, flanked by two senior executives I had only seen in town halls, and a compliance director whose presence alone signaled that this was no longer a contained problem. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. The withdrawal notice had already begun its work, rippling through systems designed to react automatically when accountability fractured. Trials were being flagged, sponsors notified that governance structures were under review, regulators quietly informed that a responsible person had raised ethical concerns. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions as the call unfolded: fear at the scale of what I had triggered, grief for the teams who would be dragged into chaos, and an unexpected calm rooted in the knowledge that for the first time I was not absorbing the pressure alone. Richard tried to reassert control, framing my actions as disproportionate, emotional, even destabilizing. Hearing him describe my decision as panic would have enraged me weeks earlier. Now it sounded hollow. The compliance director asked him to clarify why deviations had been reclassified without cross-functional approval. Silence followed, thick and telling. As questions accumulated, the narrative shifted in real time. This was no longer about my performance or temperament. It was about governance failures, about who knew what and when. An unexpected outcome emerged when one of the executives revealed that sponsors had independently raised concerns earlier, concerns that had been resolved internally without escalation. I realized then that my withdrawal hadn't created suspicion, it had validated it. The psychological pressure intensified as legal attempted to pause proceedings, suggesting internal review before external involvement, but the machinery was already moving. Automated notifications don't care about optics. I was asked directly whether I would rescind my notice if additional oversight were added. The question felt like a test, a last attempt to restore the old equilibrium. I declined, calmly, stating that trust could not be retrofitted under pressure. Saying it out loud felt like stepping off a ledge. The consequences arrived quickly. Within hours, my access was fully revoked, my badge deactivated, my email frozen. Colleagues sent quiet messages of support from personal accounts. Others sent nothing at all. I was officially isolated, and yet the isolation carried a strange relief. The unexpected turn came that evening when I received a call from an external auditor assigned to the review. She thanked me for the clarity of my documentation and asked a single, devastating question. How long had I been compensating for decisions made above my level? I answered honestly. That answer, I knew, would redirect the entire investigation. As night fell, news filtered in through unofficial channels. Trials placed on temporary hold, sponsors demanding briefings, executives canceling travel. Richard's name began appearing in conversations without his presence, a subtle but irreversible shift. The emotional weight peaked when I thought about patience waiting, about the cost of truth measured in delay and uncertainty. Doubt crept back in, sharp and insistent, asking whether any of this was worth it. The only thing that steadied me was the memory of that global call, the ease with which my reputation had been offered up to preserve an illusion. Near midnight, I received an email from compliance confirming receipt of my concerns and notifying me of an independent inquiry effective immediately. No reassurances, no apologies, just process. I sat alone in my dark apartment, phone vibrating with updates I could no longer influence, aware that by morning the outcome would be out of my hands. The system I had spent years stabilizing was now being forced to confront itself, and I had no idea whether it would correct course or collapse under the weight of what it was about to reveal. The outcome did not arrive with drama, public apologies, or a single moment of triumph. It arrived the way real consequences do inside large systems, slowly, quietly, and without offering anyone the comfort of closure. 3 weeks after I withdrew my responsible person designation, a formal letter appeared in my personal mailbox. It informed me that my position had been terminated by mutual agreement, a phrase engineered to erase cause, responsibility, and emotion in one stroke. I read it twice, not because I was confused, but because I wanted to be sure there was no hidden accusation between the lines. There wasn't. What mattered most was what the letter did not say. I was no longer named in any active investigations. My role had ended, but the spotlight had moved on. Richard's fall was less direct and far more revealing. At first, nothing happened. He continued to appear in high-level communications, still speaking in the language of reassurance and control. Then, gradually, his presence thinned. His name disappeared from meeting invites. His authority began to surface only through intermediaries. Finally, an internal memo announced his departure for personal reasons, effective immediately. No explanation, no farewell call, no acknowledgement of the damage left behind. In this industry, that kind of exit is not mercy, it is erasure. The investigations continued long after both of us were gone. Sponsors initiated independent audits, no longer satisfied with internal assurances. Regulators requested expanded documentation and historical data, asking questions that could not be answered with presentation slides. Several trials were placed on temporary hold, not because they were unsafe, but because the governance behind them could no longer be trusted at face value. The cost was enormous and unavoidable. Entire leadership layers were quietly reshuffled. No one used the word punishment. They used phrases like realignment and strategic reset, as if language could soften what had happened. Watching it unfold from the outside was harder than I expected. I had spent years inside those systems, knowing their rhythms, their shortcuts, their pressure points. Now I was cut off completely. My access was gone, my influence non-existent. Recruiters who once called weekly stopped reaching out. Word had spread, not officially, but efficiently. I was known as someone who had triggered a compliance chain reaction. In theory, integrity is celebrated. In practice, it is treated as a risk factor. I understood that, but understanding didn't make the silence easier.
The messages that did come were private and carefully worded. Former colleagues thanked me for standing firm. Others admitted they had seen the same issues and stayed quiet. Some told me I had done the right thing, followed immediately by an explanation of why they never could. None of them were wrong, but their gratitude felt heavy, almost accusatory, because it highlighted what my decision had cost and what theirs had preserved. I had not intended to become a reference point. I had only refused to be a shield. There were nights when doubt returned, sharp and persistent. I thought about patients waiting, about trials delayed, about teams thrown into uncertainty. I asked myself whether a quieter exit might have reduced the damage, whether enduring the humiliation might have protected others. The answer, each time, was the same, and deeply uncomfortable. The damage already existed. It had simply been hidden behind signatures like mine. All I had done was remove myself from the role of absorber. The unexpected resolution came months later, without ceremony. A smaller sponsor reached out, fully aware of my history and unafraid of it. They didn't want someone who could smooth over problems. They wanted someone who would document them early and refuse to carry risk alone. Accepting that role felt different from any career move I had made before. There was no illusion of safety, no promise of invisibility, just clarity and shared accountability. I don't think about Richard often now. His downfall was never the point. What stays with me is the realization that revenge does not have to be loud or personal to be final. Sometimes it is simply the act of stepping aside and letting the truth occupy the space you used to fill. Systems do not collapse because of one ambitious manager. They collapse because too many people agree to carry the weight for them. The moment you stop, everything has to rebalance. That was the cost. That was the consequence. And in the end, it was the only outcome I could live with.